Hi and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force across 3 different forces, or services as they're called now. Welcome if this is your first time, and welcome back if it's not, if you're a repeat customer. Download's very good this week again, thanks very much, and some more coffees bought for me, so I appreciate that, thank you. This is episode 65 today. We're going to talk about ship searches amongst other things. Be a bit rambling to start with. The reason being is that I've had contact from a few people now that have either just joined the police or are about to join the police or want to join the police, and those that have found the podcast have said some nice things and that this has been quite useful insight for them. So I put out a post a couple of days ago on social media. We're across all of the TikToks and Instagrams and Twitter, X, etc., and all those things, just basically saying, that if you're thinking about joining the police, this might be useful, and perhaps mention it to your colleagues that you're training with, because perhaps they'll get some use out of it as well. And it was really interesting, the response. Now, one of the things you have to understand as somebody who's coming into the police in the UK, and this may or may not be the same in other countries, I don't know, generally, the police aren't very well liked. I mean, it's always been the case, but it's probably particularly bad at the moment. And that is because in the UK, of the recent riots that we had, it's definitely, a lot of it has been aimed at the police. Now, there's lots and lots of comments and nigh on 7,000 views actually on the TikTok. It's just a picture basically saying, advertising the podcast, which is a huge response. I don't normally get anything like that, but lots and lots of messages, all mainly off the, the moaning brigade, the police are the government's Nazis and they don't do anything, and you don't have to be intelligent and you don't have any skills and you don't know the law and all the rest of it. Now, one thing you need to understand as a new police officer is that will always be the case. There'll always be those people that are like that. They're always dead against the police. They hate the police. Years ago, and it got resurrected again recently, they used to have ACAB tattoos on their knuckles, ACAB, all coppers are bastards. That also, say, made a bit of a comeback and appeared, on graffiti and stuff and became quite fashionable for a while. But what always makes me chuckle is these people that you meet in the street, you'd be outside a pub or a club, kicking out time, and the people will come out having a few drinks and you're there maybe to try and prevent trouble. They'll come up and they'll tell you how rubbish you are at the job. Their favourite line is that they pay your taxes, I pay your wages, and okay, right, what do you do then? Well, I'm on benefits, So, okay, so you're not actually paying my wages at all, and in fact I'm potentially paying yours. But that is a favourite line. It doesn't matter whether they're working or not, you'll get that all the time. I pay your wages, and you're a government agent, you've got to do my bidding. So I have no clue, these people, and obviously sometimes it's the drink speaking. But what you'll find really interesting is you'll meet those people in the street and they'll slag the police off and they'll tell you how terrible you are at your job and how, they don't need us and that they would, they'll sort all their problems themselves. And then the very next week, when they have, their car broken into or a neighbour dispute, or depending on who they are and how bad the neighbour dispute is, someone turns up at their door with a bat, or they get a text via phone or on social media threatening them, that they're going to be hurt or stabbed or something like that. Do they go out and deal with it themselves? No, they don't. They'll be on the phone to the police, which is weird because only the previous week they were saying that we're no good at our job and, we don't need us and all the rest of it. Yet they're the first people that come run into the police, and you turn up at their door and, they'll say, well, I want to report my neighbour, he's threatened me with a knife, and I want you to deal with it and I want you to investigate it. And I've got witnesses, and, and you start the investigation process, and damn well that this is the guy that was telling you how rubbish and unneeded the police were just the previous week. But the professional in you, doesn't say, well, I'm sorry, deal with it yourself. You don't need us, and walk out the door. You sit there and you smile sweetly and you take all the details and you investigate it as we do with everything else. So yeah, you are going to have to get quite a thick skin and get used to the fact that the police are not very well liked, and certainly you'll get a hard time off a lot of people. But that's just how it is, and if you really can't deal with it, then it's possibly not the job for you. You have to let it sort of wash over you. Anyway, that's 5 minutes of blah from me. Let's get on to what we're going to talk about today. So this is the point in my career, as you'll probably be aware if you've been listening, still on the Met Police dive team, and we do confined space searches and various other bits and pieces. one of the things we used to do, I wouldn't say regularly, but quite often, was ship's dives. Now, we search canals and rivers and ponds for, weapons and bodies and cars and, excuse me, all sorts of other things. But one of the things we would do every now and then are these ship searches. Now, you might ask yourself why, but this would generally be in conjunction with someone like Border Force or someone like that, who would be boarding a ship under what is called Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. It gives them a power to go on board a ship and also potentially carry out what they call a rummage search, which is, now a ship is a huge thing. I mean, these ships we're talking about, they're not dinghies. These are 200 metre long, 30, 40, 50 metre wide ships, massive cargo ships, bringing in grain and sugar and containers and all those sorts of things. It would take a team of about, 1,000 a month to properly search one of those. But we do find that the same places, hiding places, being used time and time again, and obviously the use of various electronic sort of detectors and also sniffer dogs, which are fantastic, at doing their job and giving us a really good steer. You can put them through a ship and they'll take you straight to the stash of whatever it is, whether that's guns, money, whatever. That's the internals of the ship, that's inside the ship. But what we also saw occasionally was items being brought in on the hulls of ship, on the external parts of the ship. Now, obviously, your average cop and even a very highly trained, licensed search officer is not going to be able to search those hulls. So you don't call Ghostbusters, you call the dive team, and they come out and, search the hull for you. Now, without a doubt, it was one of the most complicated, certainly the most dangerous dives that we used to do. We all used to look forward to them, to be honest, because it was something different and enjoy them, but you had to be on your A game as a diver, and doubly so as the supervisor. As a supervisor, a ship's dive was a real headache because there was an awful lot to think about, and an awful lot could go wrong very quickly. So, ship's dives, enjoyed them, but had to be treated with the respect that they deserved. So, what would happen is Border Force would approach us and they would say, we've got a ship coming in 2 days' time. It's currently out in the Atlantic. It's coming into the Thames, and we'd like to search it. And normally we would say, okay, why is that? And invariably we'd get the answer like, oh, we've got a feeling about this one. The reality is they've got some intelligence from somewhere, almost certainly, abroad, somewhere in the world, that there is something coming on that ship. And that's why we were being tasked to search it. But they would never kind of say it in so many words. So you'd be, okay, fine. The ships would either get searched alongside up in the River Thames somewhere where they came into their sort of commercial ports, which is perhaps the more common thing, or occasionally they'd be searched while they were waiting for a space to become available alongside in the busy Thames, in the commercial port. They would be asked to go to an anchorage. So quite often they would sit off somewhere like Southend or various designated anchorages around the Thames. And they would wait for their slot, and they could be out on the anchorage for 2 or 3 days waiting for a slot to come in and unload their cargo. Well, that gave us an excellent opportunity to dive on the hulls, although I'd also say it gave the bad guys an opportunity to equally use their own divers to recover whatever it is they'd brought over. What we were particularly interested in was something called parasitic attachments. A posh word, it's basically, something attached to the hull that's coming into the country that's a bit naughty, and that shouldn't come in. Now, that could be drugs, that was the more common one, but it could be weapons, firearms. Worst case scenario, it could be, explosives, or even more worst case scenario, it could have been something radioactive with a view to putting together a dirty bomb, for example, which was always a big fear and still is a big fear in this country. So it could be anything basically coming in, cash, whatever. It was quite an elaborate way of doing things though, so generally whatever you got off a ship would be pretty good, because there was plenty of other ways of bringing stuff in. Obviously the UK is an island, and with hundreds if not thousands of ports ranging from the massive commercial container ports to tiny little harbours tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Now obviously you're not going to bring a container ship in those, but even a small yacht, 30-foot yacht or something, can have quite a bit packed into it of whatever, or people of course. So we would get tasked to search a ship, and we would put together a team, and one of the first things we'd look at is the tides. Let's say we're searching this vessel in the river. Now the tides run generally for 6 hours in each direction. So it spends 6 hours coming in. There's 45 minutes to an hour's slack water where no sort of water movement happens, or very little. And then it spends 6 hours going back out again, tide coming in, tide going out. That's how it works. And it's all to do with the moon phases that control that gravitational pull, etc. So our window of opportunity to dive that hull was that sort of 45 minutes to an hour on slack water. That was the only opportunity we had. So it all had to be timed quite well. So the first thing we do is inform the PLA, the Port of London Authority, that we intended to dive, and we would obviously tell them where and what ship, etc. Although that would be done quite late, because what we didn't want is, a friendly person somewhere getting wind of it and then letting, potentially the captain of the boat or somebody on that boat that knew that there was something on it, to have an opportunity to get it off. Although once it was in the river, we couldn't dive on anything other than slack water, give or take. And equally, neither could the bad guys. They weren't putting someone in mid-tide with 3 knots of flow to recover whatever. That just isn't possible. We know that. So we'd tell the PLA, we'd put the team together. There'd probably be at least 6 of us, maybe more. You'd want as many as you could. We may well have drawn in resources from the normal marine unit as well, to have got some people to assist if needs be, because basically the more the better on a ship search. And there was extra roles to a normal dive, as we'll talk about. So that we generally dive off a rib and a rigid inflatable boat, an inflatable boat with a solid hull. That would be brought alongside the ship, and a pilot ladder would be lowered down the side of the ship. Now, these ships could be 20 metres from the top of the gunnels down to the water, so very high size, like a block of flats when you're alongside it. And that pilot ladder would be lowered to allow the supervisor and number of crew or personnel from our boat on board to various roles. And I have to say, when we came down the river and you were the diver and you saw the ship in the distance that you were going to search, bearing in mind these are, huge ships, there would definitely be just a little bit of a sort of sharp intake of breath from the divers. Certainly in my case, sometimes when you'd see the size of them, because you can't get your head round, I'm going to dive under that thing. These are very large ships, and certainly, you'd look at them and as you're approaching it and thinking, wow, that is huge. So some of the team would go on to the boat, and what we would generally do is we would leave crew on there that would help lower ropes. They'd take ropes with them, and they'd lower ropes that were attached to the ship down to the rib, and then that would be attached so that it could sit alongside the rib. Now, we always wanted to turn up probably 2 hours before slack water, because all this process took a while to set up. It wasn't like you just rocked up and put someone in the water. There was a lot of sort of planning and sort of work that went on before a diver could get in. And bearing in mind, the tide will not wait for any man, as they say, and we had to get in on that slack water. So at least 2 or 3 hours before the tide was due to be slack, we'd turn up. And then the dive supervisor and probably one other would go up and speak to the ship's captain. They'd be informed that their ship was going to be subject to a search, and none of them were worried about it, because bearing in mind, this happens all the time in all ports in all the world, so they're very used to the process. And we would, have a look at the ship's papers and have a look at the crew lists, and we would probably be joined by someone from Border Force, and maybe they used to be called Special Branch, but certainly small ports, or they got various other names, specialist police officers that will come on board and check those names against known people. Sometimes there was a language barrier, but generally the skippers would have some English, quite often quite good English, because technically the language of the sea that's used on the VHF Marine radio is English. So anyone who's trained as a captain must have, a command of the English language, which made it easier for us. Now, I'm not saying if you're French and you're coming into French waters, they will, speak in French on the radio, but officially, internationally, English is the language of the marine radio. So that generally made it easier. And while you were speaking to the skipper, the guys would be setting up in the boat. They'd be securing the rib alongside, the divers would be getting kitted, and all the stuff would be put together. We'd also have an extra boat down from the marine unit, and that would be a safety boat. Now, they would sit out in the river with what's called an A flag, which is a diver flag. It's a blue and white flag, to show that we have divers down. That would be deployed as the divers go in the water, and then that safety boat would be there should we suddenly get a speedboat or somebody come wanging up the river that's paid no attention at all. You know, you don't want big swells being put into the side of a rib that's tied alongside a huge ship with divers dangling off it, etc. So they would be there to go and, you know, basically get those guys or girls to slow down if that was happening. And just as an extra sort of safety net, really. So that would all be getting setting up. The most important job was the supervisor, the dive supervisor, and say probably one other, and maybe someone from Border Force would be going with the ship's engineer down to the engine room. Now, this was the absolute most important role there was, because those big commercial ships, they're constantly running. You know, there's machinery running all the time and various generators and engines. A lot of those are water cooled. So they suck in seawater that gets circulated around their system to cool them before it then gets spat out of an exhaust. And that's what keeps them cool. Now, you cannot just flick one switch and turn every bit of, you know, power and generator and engine off in a ship. It doesn't work like that. You'd almost certainly cause damage, and the rest of the ship would have to effectively shut down. That is not going to happen while they're doing their search. But what would happen was, depending on which side of the ship we were searching, we would have to get half of the ship shut down. So they could divert, you know, the generators on one side would only be drawing in seawater to cool, you know, from one side, let's say the port side of the vessel, if we were diving the starboard. But some engines and some things would always be running, but we'd make sure and we'd physically watch the engineer lock the prop shaft. That is the main shaft that leads to the ship's propeller that turns. Now, you might think, well, without the main engines running, you know, that prop's not going to turn. But unfortunately, there has been some horror stories about divers going in on rivers that have tidal flow. Now, props are obviously angled and shaped in such a way that they turn when they have water flow across them, normally driven by an engine. But if that prop shaft is unlocked and you get a decent amount of tidal flow over the prop, it will slowly freewheel and turn of its own accord. Now, there have been some horror stories for sure about divers being down, diving a ship that has, you know, its main engine's not on, and thinking that they were safe around the prop area. And of course, unbeknownst to them, it was turning slowly with the tide. And in one case, wrapping up their surface supply line. And this is where you really need your attendant to be switched on. So in that scenario that I'm discussing, the diver was down working near the prop. Don't forget, this is nil visibility probably, so you can't see anything at all. And you've got this huge prop. I mean, if I was diving the ship's prop, which we'll come on to in a minute, but if I stretched, you know, my fingertips from the top of the prop, bearing in mind they're generally made up of 3 or 4 blades, and then stretched out with my, you know, fins as far as I could, then I might be 7 foot long with, you know, my arms up and my fins out. I still couldn't cover one of those blades. That's how big they were. They were probably, it varied obviously a little bit, but let's say 10 foot long per blade to be searched, and there'd be 3 or 4 of them. So if you're working in an area around that, now imagine that I've got an umbilical attached to me, and that prop, unbeknownst to me, is slowly turning in the tide. What happened was, the attendant on this incident I'm talking about obviously didn't keep the umbilical, you know, tight as he should do, and there was enough slack that one of the blades picked up the umbilical. Now, slowly the prop is turning and wrapping up that umbilical. So what the attendant is feeling, that the diver, as far as he is concerned, is pulling on the umbilical to move around the ship and do whatever they're doing, whether it's work or searching or whatever. So that attendant keeps feeding line out, thinking, you know, the diver's taking line, I'll give them line, not realising it's the prop that's taking the line effectively. Well, of course, those lines are only so long. You know, they might be 100 metres long, for example. Luckily, on that occasion, the supervisor realised that the attendant just kept feeding out line, you know, and there was no way the diver had swum 50 metres away from the ship, because they could see his bubbles and that he was working tight into the hull. So why was all this line being taken? And he figured out what was going on, and they managed to, I'm not sure how it ended. The diver survived, thankfully, but he did get dragged into the prop, but it was moving so slow that he wasn't killed. But I think eventually they had to communicate with the ship, who put the shaft lock on, which stopped that prop turning while they then cut away the various lines, you know. But as a diver on the ship, all of this is going through your mind. So what would happen was, all those things would happen. The engines would be off, apart from the generators on the side you weren't working on. So there was still engines on, remember. we would hang various signs, pictures of divers and warning signs in about 10 different languages all over the sort of control panel of the engineer's control panel on the ship in the engine room, and also on the prop lock. And that wasn't enough. We still didn't trust that. We would leave a member of the team in that engine room, so that nobody walked along and, somehow didn't see the 10 signs we'd put out and thought, oh, that generator's off, that shouldn't be off, I'll just switch that over, I'll just turn that engine on or whatever. So he could not have that. So he left a member of the team, quite often border force, would stay in there with a radio just to ensure that didn't happen while we were diving. So then we would go back up and the boat would be secured in place. Now, ideally, the divers would be ready to go. We'd be perhaps, 45 minutes before the tide actually stopped, and you would have a gentle flow, maybe about a knot left as this tide is slowly coming to a halt for slack water. The diver and the supervisor would be ready, all the team would be ready, the boat would be secured in the right place, and we would generally secure ourselves about 3/4 up the length of the hull. Now, most boats have what's called a bilge keel on, which is a kind of sheet of metal that sticks out on both sides of the boat. They have a bilge keel. You have to Google it to have a look, but they can be maybe sticking out a metre or so, and the role of that was to stop or to help with the roll of the boat. This thing stuck out at an angle of about 45 degrees and ran the length of the hull, and it just supposedly slowed down the roll of that boat in heavy seas. But what it did give was a perfect opportunity for things to be attached to it. If you drilled a hole through it, you could, attach a steel box to it with something in it, which is exactly what had happened in the past. Now, when we saw the skipper, he would proudly show us, the captain, this certificate that he'd been issued with, say, Jamaica, if it was a sugar ship, from a local diver saying, I've searched your hull and I can, hand on heart, guarantee absolutely nothing is on there. So you've got a clean hull to start with, and here's your certificate. Of course, the reality is that, $200 or however much it wasn't much in the local currency, would secure you one of those certificates, and a diver would go down and tell you anything you wanted for the right amount of money. So we paid absolutely no heed to those at all, and they're basically worthless as far as we were concerned. But many times captains would proudly present them to us going, there's nothing on my hull, here's my certificate. And you'd be like, righto, making a paper plane with this in the background and sort of flinging it because it was useless. But so we would go down, and as the tide started to ease and almost dropped off, eventually we'd put a diver in. There'd still be some flow. Ideally, we'd try and be ahead of the game, and there would be a bit of tide flow still. And we might put the diver down as a little test to see whether it was workable or not, because you'd be amazed, even half a knot of tide can be too much for a diver to work. Bearing in mind, it's constant, it never stops. That's a lot of water pushing against you if you're trying to hang on for dear life onto a bilge keel. So eventually it would slow down enough the diver could work it. We'd put him or her up onto the bilge keel. They would descend down the side of the ship. Now, depending on if it was high or low tide, at high tide, there might have been 10 or 11 meters of water underneath the bottom of the ship's hull. But at low tide, it would be a lot less. It could be only a metre or two's clearance underneath the bottom of the hull. And it wasn't unusual when you were searching the prop, particularly at the bottom of the prop, that your fins could touch the bottom, which would be quite a scary prospect, because bearing in mind we're talking, a ship that weighs thousands of tons, and there's little old you diving underneath it, scrabbling around in the dark, aware that, if I was to stay here too much longer or something happens, I could get squished by this ship, down on top of me. I mean, it wasn't very likely, but it certainly went through your mind. I think you'd be mad if it didn't, if your feet touched the bottom when you were searching. But ideally, you'd get up underneath the ship and you'd put your arms either side of the bilge keel. And then at that point, it was quite a nice dive once you'd initially swum out against the flow of the tide, which was very hard work. Once you found that bilge keel, you'd start up tide end. You put your arms either side of the bilge keel, and then you'd let the tide just gently push you down the length of the bilge keel while you were searching it. Now, every now and then you'd hit anodes. They attach these big zinc anodes to those hulls that would prevent corrosion, and quite often you'd get a dead elbow as you got sort of washed into one of those and your elbow hit them, because they're quite big lumps that are attached to the ships. And then you would search the length of the bilge keel, and if you were happy, if there was nothing on that, you'd communicate that with the boat via your comms on your mast, if they were working. If not, you'd have to do it by a series of rope signals. And then you would go back to the boat, because now the boat has to reset. And in fact, the photo for this week's episode, I'll put on a picture that I've got of our rib tied alongside the stern of a ship, and you'll see it's a bit of a blurry photo. It's not brilliant, but bear with it. If you look towards the back of the ship, you'll see that one of the propeller blades, you know, about a quarter of it, the top quarter of the blade, is sticking out of the water. Because it's been unloaded, the ship obviously rises up as it gets unloaded and becomes lighter, so the prop and the rudder start to sort of stick out of the water. But yeah, you can have a look at that photo. That'll give you a bit of an idea on what I'm talking about. But now we've searched the bilge keel, we would reposition the boat towards the stern, because the next thing to search is what we call a sea chest. Now, a sea chest is, we talked about engines need to have coolant water that's sucked in from outside to keep them running and not to, so they don't overheat. Now, this sea chest could be 2 meters wide and a meter across, you know, sort of an oblong shape, or a meter by meter square, something like that. Quite substantial things, but they'd have a grill across them to stop, you know, things like, you know, tarpaulins or bags or whatever being sucked into this intake and clogging it up. But of course, what that gave people an opportunity was this nice, very well secured grill across the front of this big sort of, you know, hole in the side of the boat. Classic place that you could then bolt, you know, your box of goodies to the side. So they were things that we were really interested in. So we would find the sea chest. Now, that took some finding, because bearing in mind you've got no visibility and these ships are huge. So we had to devise a system that where we secured magnets to the side of the boat and ran a line between those two magnets, and then effectively did what we call like a jackstay search, like we do in a canal, but on the side of a ship. So you'd start off on the surface and you would move one magnet down 1 meter and then search along your line to your other magnet. Then you would lower that 1 meter into the water and search back to your other magnet, and so on and so on. So you do that concertina effect down the side of the ship, and normally you get to about 3 or 4 meters, maybe 5 meters deep in the water, and sure enough, then you'd find the sea chest and you'd be able to check it and make sure there was nothing attached to it. So that was the sea chest. Once that was done, the boat was already in position that you could also work the prop from there, and you'd move on to the prop. Now, I always quite enjoyed the props, although definitely a little bit of a bottle test at this point for sure. And don't forget that through the sides of the hull, you know, there may be steel ships and big ships, but you know, water travels, sound travels very clearly through water. So if I'm up against the prop or against the sea chest, I can very clearly hear, you know, the doof, 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 doof of generators running within that boat. And it always crossed your mind as you were searching across the sea chest that had it been in play and actually being used for cooling the engines, there'd be a huge sort of sucking force on that. And again, quite often you'd find pipes that are about the size of your fist, open holes on the side of the ship, which could be intakes for smaller generators and things. You have to be incredibly careful. You know, you cannot just go sticking your arms in those things, because imagine if you got stuck, you know. So definitely when you really focused the mind, you know, when you could hear these engine noises in the background. So we moved down to the props, and then generally I would go to the top of a prop, and I would put my fingers around the top blade of the prop, and then I would kind of slowly slide down the side of it whilst almost doing like a starfish kind of snow angel effect, you know, sweeping my arms and legs about, feeling if anything had been attached to it. It was more unlikely on the prop because it would have set up a huge vibration within the boat itself, and everyone would have been aware if something had been attached to it, but it wasn't impossible. So you'd take your time and you'd search the 3 or 4 blades on that prop. And then finally, the other one where we'd had some good finds was the rudder housing. At the top of where the rudder is attached to the ship, there's quite a big hole, and it can be big enough that I could get my entire body and head up inside it, and that then opened out into a chamber where I could sort of look around, you know, and that was within the bowels of the ship, but not accessible generally from inside the ship. It could be, sometimes they had hatches, but generally they weren't. And in the past, not only has sort of contraband been found in there, but also people. They've had people that have been trying to sort of illegally enter the country. And when the ship was unloaded and was at its highest point out of the water, rudder housing is exposed to the air. So people would actually dinghy out or even swim out and climb inside that rudder housing and then effectively make up, camp for a week while it crossed the Atlantic, and then intending to get out wherever the ship came out. Unfortunately, there was some fatalities because there's lots of things going on in there, and if the ship was now loaded and below the waterline, that could be foul air in there if there was no sort of fresh air getting in there. So unfortunately, yeah, sometimes bodies were recovered from those scenarios. And that would pretty much finish the search. It was quite detailed. While this was going on, the tide obviously is still continuing to slacken, or is now slackened completely. But after a while, particularly towards the end of the search, it would turn and start going the other way. So you could find yourself working against the flow. Physically, they're very, very tough, the ship's dives. And we had some good results. We had a few steel boxes bolted to these things that generally had drugs in. But don't forget that could be a way of bringing anything into the country. But these searches are carrying on, throughout the country at all the different ports, and by police divers. Now, of course, it's a massive task and thousands of ships coming in daily to the UK. But certainly, I think it probably helped. And yeah, we had some good results, but you had to really have your wits about you for these. And at the end of the dive, we would then tell the Port of London Authority, that's us finished. They would put out a thing on the radio saying there's now no longer divers at such and such location. Safety boat would go off, divers would be recovered. And eventually it'd be back to the base for tea and medals. It was, and hopefully a job well done. Enjoyed the ship's dives, but certainly brought a level to it. And as a supervisor, I say, you definitely breathed a sigh of relief when it was all finished, all your divers were back safely, and you were heading back to base, with everyone and everything intact. And as a diver, definitely got your attention with the engines running in the background, and praying that everyone had done their job and had shut off those water intakes. Quite interesting. Okay, thanks very much. Hopefully you found that interesting. We'll carry on next week with something else. Have a good week, and we'll speak soon. Cheers, bye.